Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of K's Labs. And the question we always ask ourselves is, what did the cat drag in? Maybe a better question might be, who the hell is this cat? I don't have a cat. I have dogs. But thank you, Mystery Cat, because every time he seems to be bringing in a new vintage synthesizer from the mid 80s. And this time it's none other than the Akai AX80. Now, the Akai AX80 is not a super common synthesizer, so I'm very, very happy that I was able to get my hands on one. And this marks Akai's first foray into analog synthesizers in the mid 80s. Before then, Akai was mostly known as a kind of like consumer electronics manufacturer, doing like stereos and things like that. And at some point in 1984, they decided, let's dive right into analog synthesis because why not? As it turns out, the timing was not the greatest for Akai because at that time, a lot of people were actually shifting interest into digital synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7. And, um, and because of that, purely analog synthesizers were falling a little bit out of favor. Little would we know, little did I know that like 30 years later, 40 years later, however long it's been, people would start looking for these guys once more and be attractive to exactly the very thing that most people didn't like in the mid 80s, which is the fact that they're like completely analog. So the AX80 is an 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer. It has two oscillators per voice, unlike the Akai AX60 that came out a couple of years later, which only has one oscillator per voice. It also has a sub oscillator. So you can make some really interesting and rich sounds. Now, the one thing that it doesn't have versus the Akai AX60 is all those cool little levers to control a bunch of parameters in real time. Everything here is controlled through these membrane buttons, and there are these displays on the front of the unit that allow you to program all the individual parameters and kind of have like an instant visual feedback. So that part is really nice. But as I say, you don't have as much real-time control. I mean, I suppose you can kind of use this knob to change one parameter at a time as you're playing, mostly like probably like the cutoff filter. It is an interesting keyboard. As you might have noticed, it's actually turned on. So it does work. I mean, it makes all the sounds. I mean, it works as expected. Where it doesn't work is some of the aesthetics. I mean, it's in really bad shape as far as the exterior is concerned. It's filthy. And in addition to that, a bunch of these buttons are not working, and the control knob is not working, and some of these knobs are also dubious and they're bent. And anyway, this thing has been through, unfortunately, hell and back. But I am here to see if we can kind of bring it back to its former glory. In addition to that, my friend Rob helped me out and made me a couple of end cheeks. And this is going to be really nice because I'm going to be replacing these guys that are really, really in bad shape and all scratched to hell. And I'm going to be putting in like brand new cheeks on this keyboard. So when all is said and done, it should look really pretty. Beyond that, the typical warning that I always give at the beginning of those videos, which is that we're going to be working with potentially live electricity, and we're going to be working with delicate circuits. And if you're not comfortable in following along, maybe it's best that you seek the help of somebody who does this professionally. But you know, like if you're careful and you do have like an Akai X80 that you're trying to repair, and you want to follow along on some of the things that I do, if you feel comfortable doing that, by all means, go for it. Just don't hold me responsible if you screw it up, because unfortunately, I am just a YouTube video. At any rate, on that note, let's dig into the Akai AX80 and see if we can bring it back to its former glory. All right, so here's the Akai AX80, and as I mentioned in my intro, it does power on and it does work. It makes sounds, which is really, really nice. I mean, that's more than half of the battle right there. I'm very, very happy about that. Now, before I get started, I thought I'd try to kind of get a game plan going as to what all that needs to happen to this particular synthesizer. So first of all, like, I mean, the keyboard for the most part works, but there are some keys that are not producing any sound. I suspect it's probably some dirty sensors underneath the keyboard. So I'm probably gonna end up removing all the keys, clean out the sensor board underneath, and hopefully that should fix that problem. There are also a couple of like small little aesthetic issues with the keyboard. I mean, I don't know if you can see here, there's like some melted plastic. And over here, this guy looks like he just kind of snapped in half at some point and it was super glued back together. So I might see if I can find some replacement for these two keys, or if not, I'll just kind of polish them and try to kind of make them look as pretty as possible. But I'm going to deal with the keyboard as the very last thing that I do. So let's move on to some of the more pressing issues with this synthesizer. First of all, like the volume knob, aside from being like the not original volume knob, it's just looking really dinky. And there's a tune knob that is actually kind of bent. And then we have this encoder that is supposed to kind of work, but it's not really doing much. So I think I'm gonna have to replace all three of these potentiometers underneath and see if I can kind of find some better knobs to put on here. I mean, this is what the original Akai knobs are supposed to look like. The buttons for the most part are working. I mean, they're a little kind of janky, but they do at least turn on and off. So I might replace the switches maybe as a quality of life thing. But rather, one of the main issue is that like these buttons are kind of sporadically working, and for the most part, they're not working at all. And some of you might be thinking, okay, no problem, just kind of go in, remove the switches, put new switches in, and that should do the trick. And that would be a good guess, except for the Akai AX80 that has like a bit of a peculiar design, and I kind of suspect something else might be going on here, because it's a little bit weird that most, if not all of those keyboard or all of those buttons would not be working. So let me show you what the problem is. This is like a bit of a poor design on the part of Akai. So the way that they connected the various PCB sections is by using this kind of weird array of, I mean, they're just like little metal rods that are like kind of hard soldered between the different PCBs. And throughout the years with playing, with moving the synthesizer around, I think like a lot of these solder joints tend to get cracked. So I bet that like if I reflow these guys, I'm probably gonna get like the majority of these buttons working back again. I mean, that's kind of my guess. However, I'll like to do one better and actually put like proper ribbon cables in between so that I avoid having this problem in the future at all. So I'm probably just gonna end up replacing this guy, and these two connector right here. And we have this PCB that is like the processor portion of the synthesizer, and it does appear to be working. There is a battery in here. I mean, I think this might be the original memory battery. It's amazing sometimes how these things can last like 40 plus years. The problem with this guy is that unlike most of the other synthesizers that I've worked on in the past, this one is mounted vertically as opposed to horizontally. I don't have any like vertical interchangeable little battery holders, so I'm probably gonna either have to buy a vertical holder for this guy, or maybe use one of my horizontal ones and, I don't know, maybe like kind of hot glue it to the side or something like that. To be determined. I haven't figured it out yet. Voice-wise, all of the voices appear to be working. I'm very, very happy about that, so I don't have to deal with trying to like test any of these chips or anything like that. Moving on to the power section, I had some high hopes that the power supply would be the same power supply as the Akai AX60. And the reason why, if you watched the video for the Akai AX60 repair, I ended up replacing it with this new power supply that's been designed by Gold, which is supposed to be a lot more efficient. It's supposed to be a lot, more stable. So I was kind of hoping that this would be like an easy swap. And unfortunately it isn't, for two reasons. One is like the form factor is slightly different. So I would have a bit of a hard time kind of mounting or even having enough space for the other power supply from the Akai AX60 in here. And the other problem has to do with the these vacuum fluorescent displays right here, which require a lot of voltage to function. So because of that, this particular power supply is designed to output that voltage, where the Akai AX60 power supply does not need to do that. What I might end up doing is test it, see how clean the power is coming out of it, and potentially like change maybe like the capacitors and maybe the voltage regulators, depending how it's working. Now, speaking of power, the other thing that this synth has is the same as the Akai AX60. Here, let me go to the back and show you. So Akai hardwired the power cable directly from the back of the unit, and of course I would much prefer if I had one of those sockets that I can use this more standard type of power cable. So I'm probably just gonna have to remove this guy, just like I did on the Akai X60, and go in with the Dremel and cut out a hole and then put the socket for this guy. So I think that's gonna be a nicer quality of life. Beyond that, almost forgot, like my friend Rob totally hooked me up with these gorgeous side panels, the little cheeks, right? So I'm going to be replacing these guys because these guys are looking pretty rough, and I don't think I'd be able to get them to look pretty again. So I think it's going to look much classier with this nice wood sides. Let's start testing pin number 1, which should be giving me 15 volts. And it does. I mean, it's pretty damn close, 15.05. The next one should be plus 5 volts. So let's check that out. It's 5.1. I mean, it's a hair high, but I mean, it's not terribly out of whack. So the next pin after that on the other side of the ground is -5. So once again, this is pretty good, -5.05. And then the very last one should be -15. And this, if you can read it, it's giving me -14.73, which is, it's a little low, well, or high, depending on how you measure these things. So what this tells me is that the negative regulator is not in the greatest shape, so maybe I might opt to change that at some point. As a matter of fact, maybe I want to change the positive 5-volt regulator as well. So anyway, something to keep in mind. But as of right now, the keyboard is functioning and running, so it's obviously able to kind of cope with like some slight inaccuracies on the voltage that it's getting. So the very, very first thing I want to do is actually remove everything, just kind of gut out the keyboard completely, take everything out so that I can give the chassis a nice wash, because this thing is absolutely filthy and I just don't want to be working with all sorts of dust and crap that's in here. I'm probably like a dead rat in somewhere. So first things first is let's take everything out so I can kind of give it a nice wash. If you ever wonder what an Akai AX80 looks like outside of the case, this is it. I mean, basically, I removed all of the pieces parts from inside the synthesizer, and just as I suspected, these button PCBs, the moment that I removed the screws, these things just came loose. There was absolutely no contact with the solder points in here, or same thing in here. It just literally just kind of came apart. So that tells me that very likely the reason why none of these buttons were working is because of this weird connectors that Akai decided to use in this particular synth. Now, I could just kind of resolder them together, but what I'm going to do instead is put like some ribbon cables in between so that hopefully this very issue is not going to happen again in the future. And I think while I'm at it, I'm probably just going to replace the buttons anyway, because I do have some, and why not? I mean, my guess is that after about like 40 years, these buttons are a little wonky. So I might as well replace them as well. What else was I gonna do? Oh yeah, like the power supply. I marked the two voltage regulators that I suspect are not working 100%. So I'm gonna replace those two. I might replace some of these capacitors. They look pretty good. I mean, I don't see any bulging or anything like that, which is usually a sign that they might be failing. So it's probably overkill. But while I'm in here, I might as well just kind of replace the capacitors while I'm at it, if I have those in stock. The other thing I was gonna do is there is the memory battery right here, and as I said, it's a little unusual because it's mounted vertically instead of horizontally. I was looking to buy maybe like a vertical mount, and then I thought about it. I was like, I think the vertical mount that I could find online is not quite this anyway. So I might as well just kind of run a couple of wires and just kind of connect it to a regular horizontal mount, which I will then hot glue somewhere in the case. And what else? I mean, I'm just going to try to like dust everything off and just kind of trying to make it a little cleaner. Here's the keyboard. I'm probably going to do the same thing I always do, which is remove all the keys and give them a nice polish and clean. And then go underneath, take a look at the sensors, and maybe like kind of clean out all the sensors with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, or sometimes even like a pencil eraser. But yeah, like, I mean, like, hopefully I didn't make anything worse. I don't think so. I did have to like cut a couple of wires here that you might notice. These guys have been actually cut. And the reason why is because these guys actually went out to the MIDI jacks on the outside of the case, and there was really no way for me to remove the MIDI jack without cutting the cable. So I'm just gonna have to like resolder them. Like always, I always recommend that you take meticulous photos of everything, just so you know how to put everything back together, which I did. So, so hopefully that's going to guide me and avoid any potential mistakes. Now, in the meantime, let me show you what I've been doing with the rest of the case. All right, so I have a piece of the case here, and I cleaned it. And, it's looking a little rough. I'm going to try to research about like seeing if there's some way to like kind of maybe sand it down a little bit and like kind of touch it up, because it would be nice to kind of make this look a little neater. The bottom side of the case, however, I was able to sand down completely, and I am in the process of spray painting it so that it looks nice on the bottom, even though nobody's gonna see it. But still, I think it's gonna help make this unit feel as new as possible. All right, so the underneath portion of the chassis is all nice and clean and repainted, along with this little piece of metal that fits on the front right here. And what I also did is I used my Dremel tool to make a larger hole here, so I can kind of put this power socket in here, and I think it's just going to be much nicer, and it's going to make it compatible with all of my other power cables. So this guy is done. Now I need to turn my attention to the PCBs, and I'm just going to move everything onto the workbench and start dealing with what I need to do on that side. So I do want to take a look at the flip side of these PCBs, just to kind of keep an eye out and see if there's something that looks a little bit odd. So we have the CPU PCB and then the voice PCB on this side. And for the most part, like the CPU PCB on the back side looks pretty nice and clean, and I don't see anything out of the ordinary. However, on the voice board, I've noticed a couple little things. I mean, first of all, there's this strip that I don't know if it's acting as a bit of an insulation, and it looks like there have been some resistors that have been put on certain points on the back side, and then there's a couple of these little jumper cables that have been also soldered in place. Now, just because those things look a little bit weird, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. I mean, the synth does work after all. So this could be part of a revision on the part of Akai. I'm not sure. I just need to do a little bit of research and just kind of, I mean, I'm not going to change anything because, as I said, like the keyboard does work. I just want to understand a little bit what might be happening here. And the other thing I'm noticing is like there's a great deal of this soldering residue left on this board in particular. There's a little bit on here too. So what I probably want to do is just kind of go in and spritz some pure alcohol and just go in with a toothbrush and just kind of clean it up a little bit. Oh, there's one more thing that I do want to look at, which is I do want on the CPU board, I do want to replace the battery. And it's coming in on these two guys. I mean, this guy's obviously the ground and then the positive on that side. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wire um, two cables, and then I'm just going to go to a regular flat swappable battery holder. And then I'm probably just going to hot glue it somewhere on the inside of the keyboard where there's like a little bit of space. I think it's going to look neater overall. And especially because, as I said, I don't have one of those vertical mounts for the battery. On one of my other videos, somebody had complained that I don't go into too much detail as to how I'm doing stuff. And so I thought, okay, well, let me show exactly what I'm doing here with this battery change. So this is what I want to be using. This is like a little horizontal battery holder. It's a similar size battery, similar voltage. So I mean, I think it's going to do fine. And basically on this side there's a positive and a negative pin, and these two guys just simply have to match so that I put like the positive pin is going to where the positive is and the negative is going to where the negative is. So in the case of the circuit board, um, I don't know if you can kind of see very clearly, but anyway, like the battery's mounted here. So this is obviously the negative. It's connected to the ground. You can kind of tell because it's just hooked up to this really wide trace here, and the other guy is the positive, and that's really it. So what I'm gonna do is with my soldering iron is trying to remove the old battery. I do have my handy dandy Hacko desoldering tool, which a lot of you pointed out is a lifesaver, and I agree. This is one of the best things that I bought, and I really love this guy. But in this case, it wasn't really able to kind of get this thing freed up, so I'm just going to try to do it the traditional way and very, very slowly see if I can melt the solder just enough to slip this guy out. I mean, keep in mind that this is also old solder, so it's a little more difficult to kind of get rid of. But yeah, I mean, all I need to do is just kind of heat it up a little bit and slip this guy out. There you go. So this is the old battery that you can see. Um, and yeah, all I need to do now is to run two wires. I'll probably use like a black one from this side since this is supposed to be the ground, and then I'm going to use a red one. I'm just probably going to solder them, put them from the top down, and then solder them on the underside, so it's going to look a little bit cleaner. And that will be that. And then all I have to do is just hook up the wires to the proper connecting pins on this battery holder. And at that point, the only thing that I need to do, as I said, is probably just find like a little spot somewhere inside the keyboard that I can hot glue it, and that will be my little swappable battery holder. And I think it's just going to be nicer for future battery swaps. Okay, so I prepped two wires. As I said, a black one and a red one, just to be very, very clear. The red is going to be positive and the black one is going to be negative. I'm just gonna go and feed this one from the top side here. And as I said, this guy is connected to the ground, so it's going to be negative, and the other guy is going to be the positive, obviously. So there you go. That's it. So these two guys are hooked up. If I can, I'm gonna keep them. I'm not gonna cut them quite yet, just because I don't know where I want to put my my little battery adapter in the case. So I'm just gonna hold off on snipping them off until I put these PCBs back in the case and I have a better idea of where it is that I actually want to put this battery holder in there. So the CPU board looks great. The voice board, I put like some new electrical tape on here as a way of isolating these guys from the rest of the board. And aside from that, there was another small little red flag. Let me zoom in here. Maybe you might be able to see this or not. But basically, there's like a little teeny tiny scratch that's going across all these traces. And it made me a little bit nervous at first because if you watched my Akai AX60 repair video, I had a similar problem that was keeping the chorus from working on that synthesizer. And so what I did is I just used my multimeter and just kind of checked for continuity between all of those pins and their respective endpoints here, and everything does check out. So I'm glad. I'm glad I don't have to like kind of worry about this scratch interrupting some of the signal here. Processor board, voice board are back into the bottom chassis, and it's going to be kind of nice and safe in here and hopefully not get damaged. So the next thing I want to tackle is the power supply, and I did put some markings on these two voltage regulators because I think that there might be some slight kind of malfunctions in there that they're not like giving me the correct voltage readings. And while I'm in there, I might possibly also swap out the capacitors. I don't know if there's anything specifically wrong with these capacitors, but I figure if I'm in there, I might as well just kind of take care of it for posterity's sake. Took out the heatsink just to have a little bit more room to maneuver around here. I do have replacement voltage regulators for both of these guys. I mean, as a matter of fact, if I wanted to, I could replace all of the voltage regulators. I don't know if it's necessary. Now, as far as the capacitors are concerned, I do have a replacement for this guy. This is a 6800 microfarad 16 volt capacitor, so I have a replacement for that if I want to replace that. However, these two guys are 1000 microfarads, 50 volts, and I only have 1000 microfarads, 25 volts. Now, if I look at the schematic over on my computer, you might be able to see here. I mean, here is the 1000 microfarad, 35 volts. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's like negative 20 volts and negative 19.9 volts passing around them. So chances are that like the 25 volts would probably be fine. However, as I said, I mean, maybe it's just not necessary for me to replace and take the risk, so I might as well just kind of leave them alone. Same thing with this guy. That's a 220 microfarads, 50 volts, and if I look here on the schematic, here it is, 220 microfarad, 50 volt, and this guy actually has like a 38.4 line going through it. So the 25 volt one that I have is probably not necessarily good. All the smaller guys are 10 microfarad, 50 volts, which I have plenty of. So if I wanted to, I could kind of replace all those. I think the power supply is done, at least for now, until I can hook it back up. But basically, I replaced the 7915, which is responsible for the negative 15 volt rail, and the 7805, which is responsible for the 5 volt positive rail. And I also, while I was at it, I put in like a new capacitor for the 6800 16 volt, and then a bunch of these like 10 microfarad 50 volt capacitors since I had them. If you do the same thing, just kind of be careful, because actually, even though all of these guys are 10 microfarad, this one right here, C19, is actually a 1 microfarad, and I kind of sort of screwed up at first, and I had to go in and resolder it. I mean, beyond that, like, everything looks fine. So as I said, I need to hook it back up and make sure that, you know, it's going to be working, and it's going to be outputting like the correct voltages. But for right now, until I hook it back up to the power supply, or to the actual power, I can't really test it. So for right now, let's call it done. So it turns out I don't have enough of these switches to replace all of these guys, and all of these guys, and all of these guys. So I had to order some more of these guys, these little switches. They should be arriving here the next day or so, but I figured, like, maybe in the meantime I can kind of start desoldering. So things are starting to come together a bit slowly, but little by little, I'm kind of reassembling the AX80 into one piece. So where we left off is that I have to replace all the switches on these PCBs, and I soldered in the ones that I did have, but I was waiting for some new switches to arrive, and they just came in. This is from Taida. I mean, if you're curious about like what the SKU is, here it is. I think the switches are fine. I mean, there's a lot of people saying, oh, you should only use like the more expensive ones, but I don't know. I think for this particular usage, I think these are just fine. So what I also did in the meantime is I replaced the interconnects. So this is this piece right here that used to be soldered right there. You can still see it on these two other boards. And basically all I did is just kind of soldered some wires in between. And I think it's just going to be a little bit more flexible and more resistant to just kind of disconnecting like the, you know, like these guys do. For these guys, I'm probably just going to leave them alone since they do seem to be working. Maybe I'll just kind of reflow the solder. But overall, like, I'm probably not going to touch those. But these guys, since they were pretty much shot, I just replaced them with these wires, and then I need to connect this last one to these guys right here. So I need to like remove those. There's some switches that need to be replaced on this control board as well. So I already removed them, and I just need to like kind of solder them back in. So, okay. Oh, I mean, while I was at it, when I was ordering from Taida, I also got a couple of these 1000 microfarad 50 volts and 220 microfarad 50 volts, and I can replace these two guys and this guy on the power supply, and that way I will have recapped the power supply completely. But for now, I'm just gonna get onto the business of resoldering the brand new switches onto this guy and onto this guy. All right, so the main row of button switches are all in. Hopefully they won't work, but I won't know until I hook them back up. So with this guy done, I'm just going to put this aside for now, and I'm going to turn my attention over to the other control board. So this is what would normally fit over this section right here of the synth. And as I said, I already removed the switches except for this one, because if you look on the back, there's this little wire hooked up to it. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that I kept that, because obviously this is part of some sort of update or something like that. But yeah, and then the only other thing that I need to do is just remove these interconnects that I don't want to use, and then just kind of solder in the other button strip to this guy, and then this section will be all done. This guy is back together as well with all the new switches. Now comes the most tedious part, which is to do the interconnects between these guys and this guy. It's kind of slow, tedious, and precision work, so I'm just going to do this off camera. But basically, I'm just going to solder one by one, and then I will test with a multimeter for continuity, just to kind of make sure that everything is connected properly. As I said, it's kind of tedious, but it's necessary. And I think it will be a big improvement over using these guys, which I think are just the recipe for disaster. All right, so this is definitely not the most fun I've ever had with a soldering iron, but I do think that this is better than this. What I need to do now is I need to check the continuity, because I want to make sure that everything's corrected to where it's supposed to, and I also want to make sure there's no connections where they're not supposed to. So I'm going to take out my handy dandy multimeter and test for continuity, and hopefully, keeping my fingers crossed, everything is where it's supposed to be. I always say that it doesn't really make much sense if I'm just kind of literally going like this, because all I'm doing is really just kind of testing that like the wire is working, and that's not really what I need to know. I need to know that like there are that these connects are truly connected, and I'm not just kind of like testing the wire itself, if that makes any sense. So what I need to do is just kind of follow some of these traces around a little bit further down on the board. So if I follow some of these traces, let's say like this guy right here is ending up I think right here. Where is it going to? It's going right here. Okay. Same thing with this guy. So I know that that's working. So if I follow this guy down, it's ending up right here. So now I know for sure that there's like a good connection between these 2 points. Okay. And of course, I also want to make sure that I am testing for continuity between adjacent pins, just to kind of make sure that I didn't accidentally like create a bridge with the solder, because it is kind of tight. Everything checks out, and everything checks out on this side. So I think this entire assembly is ready to go back into the unit. When I placed my order for the switches, I also ordered some new capacitors. So I'm just gonna go and replace these two 1000 farad microfarad capacitor, and then this guy, which is a 220 microfarad right here. So effectively the whole power supply will be recapped. It might not be necessary, but while I'm at it, might as well do it. Before I hook everything back up, I want to test out the voltages to make sure that the voltages that are coming out of the power supply are correct and within spec. So let's do that first. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit of what I'm seeing, even if you can't see everything. So first things first, I'm going to turn it on. Okay, and we should have power going to the various pins here. So let's start out with the main one. So this one should be giving me 15 volts, and I do get 15 volts, 15.14. That's looking good. Next one is 5, so 5.137. And then on the other side, I should have negative equivalents. So negative 5.0 and negative 15.3. Okay, I mean, I think it's within range. The next one should be, I think, like plus 15 and minus 15. Yeah, 15.1 and minus 15.3. So, I mean, I think that's, within spec where we need to be. testing on this guy. Let's see here. On this side, I think I have like a, let me see, 5 volts. And then on the other side, I should have the one that's going to the vacuum displays, which should be negative 42 volts. Yeah, so that's pretty much where it needs to be. On this guy is, I have like a negative 5. And then last but not least, I think I should have like an 8 volt, 8.5 coming out of this guy. 8.487. Okay. I mean, I think that's close enough to where I need to be. So I feel relatively safe plugging everything in and see if the synth will at least come back to life. Keyboard is not hooked up. This stuff is not hooked up. I don't have the knobs there. But the displays, we should be seeing something on the displays. And ideally, all of the buttons should now be working if I did my job correctly with the new interconnects. Let's find out. All right, so this is a good sign. The displays are all seem to be working, and let's see here. Look at that. All of the buttons are working. So I'm very, very happy about that because before none of these buttons were working. So this is great. Okay, on that note, we are still ways away from being finished with repairing or refurbishing the synth. So the next thing I need to know is replace the potentiometers on these guys and this guy. I might replace these guys, although I think they're probably fine. I do want to clean up the assembly. I want to clean out the keyboard, and I want to find a spot where to put the memory battery. But other than that, I'm very, very happy because I always operate under the philosophy of like, do no harm. So I'm always a little bit worried that like by removing all of the circuit boards and, you know, cleaning them and doing all that stuff and then just kind of putting back in, I'm going to screw something up. And in this case, I'm happy that at least on the surface, it does appear that everything is still fully functional as it was before. So keeping my fingers crossed because I won't know until I hook the outputs back out and actually hear the synth in action. But let's move on to the potentiometers next. All right, so the AX80 uses 3 potentiometers of sorts here. One is used for the tuning, one is used for the volume output, and one is for this big control wheel right here. And they all appear to be 10K linear potentiometers. So normally that's just called like a 10 kb potentiometer. Here's the one for the volume control, and here's the one for the tuner. Something about the focus. I have replacement for these guys, so I'm not expecting this to be particularly problematic. However, the one that is used for the larger knob is this guy right here. Now, this, for all intents and purposes, appears to say 10 kb. I mean, it appears to be a 10 kilo ohm linear potentiometer. However, I mean, it's a little bit different in the sense that like it's got like this much wider base. I don't know if what I have is going to be a good replacement for this, but there's only one way to find out. So I'm just going to go and replace all 3 of these guys and then see if they actually work. All right, so I have these 3 10 kb potentiometers installed in these 3 slots. I can't check these 2 guys until I hook up the output section, which is still disconnected, and the keyboard, so that's kind of a little bit ways away. But I can check this control knob. As I said, like, I mean, this guy was a little bit weird looking to me, but it does say 10 kb, so I replaced it with a 10 kilo ohm potentiometer, and let's see if it works. I mean, let's just kind of turn it on. Let me turn this light away so you can see the LEDs a little bit. I'm going to go into edit mode, and then the best way is to probably select one of these guys and start turning this guy. Okay, well, look at that. I mean, it appears to be working the way it's supposed to. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of neat. I guess this is just like 0 or 1. Let me see, one of these guys maybe. Yeah, There you go. So I guess it is just like a 10 kilo ohm potentiometer. So that's good. That's good to know because I could not find this exact duplicate anywhere online. So, whew. I've been just kind of reassembling everything together. I did thoroughly clean the mod wheel, pitch wheel, little assembly, and I'm actually using like brand new knobs. I mean, I know that like some of you might disapprove and say, oh, no, you should be using like the original Akai knobs because you want to preserve the exactness of the keyboard. I don't personally subscribe to that. I ended up getting like these really nice metal aluminum knobs and they're all matching and I kind of like the aesthetic, and plus I changed the cheeks anyway, so I mean, who cares really? All I'm interested in is to make this keyboard as functional as possible. Now, one of the things that I did want to bring up is that in order to clean the outside chassis thoroughly, I had to like kind of disconnect all this stuff. And while the inputs and outputs, the tape stuff and all that kind of stuff was pretty easy, you just kind of like unscrew these two screws, and same thing with the switch, and just kind of pull it out. The MIDI inputs and outputs were a little trickier. And the reason why is because they kind of snap into place with the plastic. So these guys come out this way, but they're like soldered to wires on the inside. So I had to like snip off the wires. I mean, there was just like no way around it. So I had to kind of go back in and resolder the MIDI wires. And as always, I always say like take photos because it's always really important so that you'll remember exactly what goes where. So let me just kind of point out a couple of things here. If you guys are following along and you plan to do the same thing that I did. So here's like the three MIDI knobs, okay? So these are like the wires that I had to kind of snip off. And I wanted to point out two important things to keep in mind. So between the middle, which is the MIDI through, and the MIDI out port, there's a little black wire that goes from the middle pin, if you can see, to the other middle pin here. And then from the other middle pin, this guy is actually soldered onto this output board. I think this is just the ground. But nonetheless, I think it's important that you realize that you have to like solder this black wire back onto the board as well. Everything is effectively reconnected internally except for this stuff that goes to the keyboard. Here is the keyboard assembly of the AX80, and if we flip it around, you can see like, I mean, it's all of these keyboards for the most part, between like the Korgs and the Oberheims and all that kind of stuff, tend to be fairly similar around this era. So, I mean, we have like one main PCB, that's our sensors, and then we have like the individual keys that kind of like snap in place with these little tabs that I have to be very, very careful not to break off because they tend to be a little touchy. So the keyboard has been like thoroughly cleaned. I polished it. I mean, it looks a lot better than it did at the start of the video. So this part is done. And now I have the sensor board. And before I put it back in with the keyboard and put the keyboard back into the synth, I thought that it would probably be a good idea to go through all of the sensors that I cleaned just to make sure that everything is actually triggering the way it's supposed to, so that I know that all the keys are going to be working. The synth is on. I have a set of headphones here plugged in, so hopefully you guys are going to be able to hear. And it's a little bit wobbly, so like the triggering is going to be uneven. But let's see here. I'm just going to go down the various keys and just kind of hit them. Let's see. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but I mean, basically so far everything is triggering correctly. Okay, I don't know if you could actually hear, but like basically all of the sensors are triggering nodes on the synth. So I know that they're all working. Now all I have to do is put this back with the keyboard and put the keyboard back. And I think we're going to be pretty damn close to calling this thing done. All right, so after testing the sensors, I put the keyboard back and everything is hooked up now. So now is the final test. Let's see if all the keys are actually working. I have my headphones hooked up, so hopefully you can hear what I'm hearing. All right, so all the keys work. That is fantastic news. So at this point, I think everything that I needed to do to the Akai AX80 has been done. I just need to put like the clear cover back on, and then I can reassemble everything and just run a final test. All right, here it is, the fully repaired, restored Akai AX80. I am really happy with how this came out. So just to recap some of the things that were done to bring the synthesizer back to its full restored state. We started out with replacing the built-in power cable in the back with a standard power socket. I think it's just going to make it a lot nicer to use it and move the synthesizer around. And the next thing I did is open up the synth and take a look at the voltages, and I saw that there was a couple like kind of voltages that were a little bit kind of funky. So what I decided to do is like kind of take out all the components, clean everything out, and then replace a couple of the voltage regulators in the power supply, as well as all the electrolytic capacitors. And the idea is just simply to kind of like feed as clean power as possible to the rest of the synthesizer. Then the next thing to do was to replace all of the button switches because none of them worked. Everything for all of those membrane buttons, and I replaced the 3 potentiometers, one for the volume, one for the tuning, and one for the data selector. And of course, I also replaced those kind of weird interconnects between the various PCBs for the controls with just some simple wiring that I think is going to make it more resistant to any failure in the future. So done that, I put in like a new memory battery in there and put like a memory battery holder, so it's going to make it a lot easier to change the battery in the future. Then I cleaned out all the keyboard, polished all the keys, cleaned out all the sensors just to kind of make sure that all of the keys were working. Tried to kind of like clean out, there was like a burn mark here. This key is still cracked. Unfortunately, I might replace it in the future, but right now it looks a lot better. It doesn't bother me so much. What else? Oh, one of the most important things, special thanks to my friend Rob for totally hooking me up with this wonderful wooden cheeks. He did this for the Akai AX80 as well as the Akai AX60 that I have up here, and I really appreciate his help. And this was like trickier than you might think, but I think it looks so much nicer, and personally I think that natural wood looks great with vintage synthesizers. I can't wait for you guys to hear what this synth sounds like in an upcoming jam video. And in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next K's Labs video.